Imagine looking at a 6-year-old child and not actually seeing a child.
Right.
Like imagine looking at them and just seeing a smaller, maybe slightly less experienced person. No concept of childhood as this, magical, protected, completely separate phase of human existence.
Which is really hard for us to even conceptualize.
Yeah, I mean, for most of us, that sounds borderline absurd. It sounds like a total failure of empathy, honestly. But what if the very concept of childhood-like, the way we categorize it, the way we enforce it, and build these massive institutions around it, what if that is actually a relatively recent invention?
And an invention that maybe wasn't created to protect people, but rather to control them.
Right. And welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking you on a really intense intellectual journey. We are going to completely deconstruct our foundational assumptions about education.
Yeah, it is a profoundly uncomfortable thought experiment, really.
Yeah.
We build our entire societal infrastructure around the premise that there is this distinct class of humans called children. And we believe they require a very specific, highly structured environment. So to challenge that is to basically pull at the loose thread of modern civilization.
Exactly. Usually when we talk about human development, there's this expectation of precision. It's like looking at a medical x-ray,
Oh, absolutely.
You break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line, the doctor points to it, and the diagnosis is binary, broken or not broken. We try to apply that same mechanical precision to how human beings learn and grow.
Yeah, we build these massive concrete structures called schools, and we expect them to function exactly like that X-ray machine.
Right. You put a person in, the machine does its work, and a predictably educated person comes out.
Because we crave that visibility. We want to be able to point to a diploma and say, there is the proof of learning. It makes the chaos of the human mind feel manageable and safe.
Well, today we're looking at a text that takes a sledgehammer to that entire framework. We have excerpts from Phenomenology of School and Rituals of Progress by Ivan Illich.
Yeah.
And I have to say, this text doesn't just tap lightly on the glass. It completely shatters it.
Yeah, the author is essentially asking us to examine the water we're swimming in. And to do that, he introduces this concept that sits at the center of his argument, which is deschooling society.
But real quick, before we go any further, I need to pause and establish some super important context for you, the listener, because this source material is intense.
Very intense.
It was written in a specific era, and it uses heavily politicized, radical, and sometimes deeply controversial viewpoints to make its case. You're going to hear blistering critiques of capitalism, references to Marxism, and direct, uncomfortable comparisons to the Vietnam War.
Which can be a lot to take in.
It is. So I want to be absolutely clear here. Our goal on this deep dive is not to endorse these views. We're not taking a side, left or right. We're just impartial guides. Our job is to unpack the author's arguments so that you can look at them and examine them for yourself.
Right, because the value of a text like this isn't necessarily in adopting its worldview wholesale. The value is in the intellectual friction, right?
Exactly.
It forces you to clarify your own understanding of a system you probably interact with every single day. So to set up this central premise of deschooling, the author draws a fascinating parallel to theology.
Oh yeah, the Dietrich Bonhoeffer comparison. Okay, let's unpack this.
So he brings in Bonhoeffer, who was a theologian grappling with the state of Christianity. And Bonhoeffer made this deeply controversial argument about the confusion between the core biblical message and the institutionalized machinery of religion.
Basically saying that Christian freedom and faith actually gain strength from secularization.
Exactly. He suggested that faith thrives when it's separated from the heavy bureaucratic administration of the church, which sounded like absolute blasphemy to many churchmen at the time.
And the author takes that exact structural argument and just maps it directly onto education.
Yes. He suggests that just as faith might benefit from being untangled from formal religion, the actual organic act of learning stands to gain immensely from being untangled from the rigid institution of schooling.
Which he admits sounds like treason to the Enlightenment.
All right. But his counter-argument is that the true spirit of the Enlightenment-like independent critical inquiry is actually being snuffed out inside the walls of the school.
So he's separating learning from schooling right out of the gate. That's a massive conceptual leap.
It is. And to make that leap, he realizes he can't just use the word school loosely. He says words like school and teaching have become completely amorphous. He actually compares them to an amoeba.
An amoeba?
Yeah.
Because they just shift to fit whatever gap in language we have.
Exactly. They're linguistic amoebas.
No.
He notes that we casually say things like, ABM will teach the Russians, referring to anti-ballistic missiles.
Wow, yeah.
Or we say IBM will teach children, talking about computers. We even refer to the Army as the school of a nation. When a single word can describe a missile system, software, and a kindergarten, it's lost all its analytical utility.
So to pin it down, he does what he calls a phenomenology of public school.
Right.
He strips away all the lofty, abstract goals.
Yeah.
No talk about moral development or shaping leaders of tomorrow. He defines it strictly by its observable, mechanical traits.
And his definition is brutally specific. He defines school as an age-specific, teacher-related process requiring full-time attendance at an obligatory curriculum.
Notice what's missing there.
No mention of learning.
Exactly. None. It's strictly structural. And the moment he establishes that definition, he attacks the first pillar, the requirement that it be age-specific. Which brings us back to that wild idea we opened with, the claim that childhood is a recent Western invention.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really provocative.
I have to push back here, though, because humans obviously go through biological stages. An infant isn't an adult. A 10-year-old can't lift what a 30-year-old can lift.
Of course.
So are we supposed to just pretend kids are tiny, fully formed adults?
Yeah.
Because that seems factually wrong and honestly dangerous?
Well, the text isn't denying biological reality. Infancy, adolescence, youth, those physical and cognitive stages have always existed. What the author is attacking is the modern mass-produced concept of childhood as a distinct, socially segregated class.
Okay, so the social construct.
Right. He points out that for the vast majority of human history, childhood, the way we culturally perform it today, was completely unknown.
The historical context he gives is jarring. He talks about art before the Renaissance. Artists literally painted infants as miniature adults.
Yeah, they didn't even conceive of children having different bodily proportions.
They just painted a grown man, shrunk him down, and sat him on a mother's lap.
And that artistic representation reflected the social reality. The worker's child, the peasant's child, they didn't exist in a protected bubble. They dressed exactly like their fathers, did the same labor scaled to their size, and played the same games.
And he makes that grim observation about the laws, too.
Yes, that a young person could be hanged by the neck just like their father. There was no blanket immunity based on age.
Which is horrifying. But the text argues this whole construct of childhood arrived with the bourgeoisie, with pocket watches and Christian moneylenders.
The pocket watch detail is brilliant.
It really is, because a pocket watch represents the compartmentalization of time. You need a watch to know when the school bell rings.
Exactly. You needed to categorize people by how many hours they've spent in a classroom.
But even knowing that history, I still find myself defending the concept. Like, surely giving kids a protected space to play without adult pressures is a moral triumph, right?
The author challenges that at its core. He argues that this mass-produced concept of childhood, which only became possible with industrial wealth, is actually a massive crushing burden on the young.
A burden. How so?
Well, we impose impossible expectations on them. We expect them to have no independent income, to always do exactly as they are told, and to tolerate being treated in ways that any adult would find deeply condescending.
Oh, that makes sense. The text brings in literary references here,
Yeah.
right? Like Stephen Dedalus from James Joyce and Alexander Portnoy from Philip Roth.
Yes. For figures like them, childhood wasn't this magical time of innocence. It was suffocating. It was a constant inhuman conflict between their developing self-awareness and the strict, submissive role society demanded of them.
They were just trapped in the role of the child.
Exactly. It's an artificial cage enforcing dependency. And he shares this anecdote from the Andes to prove how artificial it is.
Oh, the story about Marcos, the night watchman. This completely shifted my perspective.
It's a powerful story.
The author is talking to Marcos, and the topic turns to Marcos's 11-year-old son who works in a barber shop. And the author casually refers to the son using the Spanish word niño, meaning child.
And Marcus's reaction is the hinge of the whole argument. He looks surprised, gives this guileless smile, and says, "Don Ivan, I guess you're right."
Which is crazy. The author realizes that Marcos had never thought of his son as a child in the Western sense. He just saw him as a sensible person contributing to the community.
Right. The author realizes he had just drawn this invisible artificial curtain of childhood between two sensible human beings.
And then he compares Marcos to a New York slum dweller.
Yes, if you called the New Yorker's working 11-year-old a child, the parent wouldn't be surprised. They'd be deeply resentful that their son is being denied his childhood by economic hardship.
Because they feel violently deprived of this modern invention, whereas Marcos hasn't been afflicted with a yearning for it yet.
Exactly. It's a total paradigm shift. We assume children inherently need school, but the text argues the reverse schools need children.
You can't sustain a massive authoritarian institution unless you first artificially segregate a chunk of the population and legally require them to submit to it.
Exactly. So if society has boxed humans into this category, we have to ask, who is the warden of that box?
Right, which leads us to the teacher. And the text tackles this core institutional wisdom, which is the axiom of teaching.
The unquestioned belief that learning is the direct result of teaching. We believe if you know something, it's because someone formally taught it to you.
And the author just completely attacks this. He says we learn the most vital things like how to speak, how to love, how to play, how to navigate politics entirely outside of school.
Organically. He even points out that people under constant formal care, like orphans or even school teachers' own kids, acquire most of their knowledge outside the planned process.
Wait, hold on. Let me push back. If I didn't learn to read from my first grade teacher, who did I learn it from? Because I distinctly remember sitting on a carpet with Mrs. Davis doing phonics worksheets.
Sure, he doesn't deny that instruction can happen in a classroom, but he argues the environment of learning is far more crucial than the formal instruction.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning you learned to read because you were in an environment saturated with text, where reading was valued, and your brain was developmentally ready. The teacher just facilitated a process your environment was already demanding.
Ah, place.
But the school claims a monopoly on this process. It convinces us that only the formal instruction matters, ignoring the massive invisible web of organic learning happening all around us.
And the tragedy of that monopoly really hits home when you look at populations without access to it. The text points out that half the world never sets foot in a school.
Right, they don't have teachers, they can't even drop out because they were never let in.
Yet they learn the school's primary lesson flawlessly.
They learn that they are inferior.
Because the school is the sole gatekeeper of legitimacy. So simply by existing, it instructs the unschooled that they lack inherent value.
They subscribe to a societal creed that economic and social salvation only comes through the school.
So if teachers aren't the primary source of learning, what are they actually doing in that room for 8 hours a day?
Well, the text breaks down the classroom into a sacred milieu. In this highly controlled space, the teacher takes on 3 overwhelming roles: the custodian, the moralist, and the therapist.
Let's break those down. The custodian first.
As custodian, the teacher acts as a master of ceremonies, guiding pupils through drawn-out rituals. They arbitrate arbitrary rules, drill routines, when to stand, sit, speak. They administer physical time and bodily autonomy.
Like managing the logistics of a very restless factory. Then we have the moralist.
Right, where the teacher substitutes for parents, God, or the state. They indoctrinate the pupil about right and wrong, operating in loco parentis to ensure every child feels like a subordinate to the state.
And then the most invasive one, the therapist.
Yes, the teacher feels authorized to delve into the personal, psychological life of the pupil. It's often framed benevolently as helping the child grow, but the author argues it's much darker.
Because it's fused with the power of the custodian and the moralist.
Exactly. The teacher uses psychological leverage to persuade the pupil to submit to a domestication of their own vision of truth.
The metaphor he uses here is so vivid. He says the teacher wears an invisible triple crown, specifically comparing it to the papal tiara.
It's staggering authority.
Imagine standing before a professional who possesses the combined, unchecked power of a judge, an ideologue, and a doctor, all sitting behind one desk.
And the constitutional implications are genuinely chilling. The author points out that children in a school essentially have no First or Fifth Amendment rights before a teacher.
Their age just disqualifies them from basic legal safeguards.
Right. Even adults in restrictive environments, like an asylum or a jail, retain more distinct boundaries of their rights than a child in a classroom.
That's a huge distinction. If an adult gets a speeding ticket, the judge doesn't tell them they're fundamentally a bad person who needs psychological help.
But under the teacher's eye, morality, legality, and personal worth collapse into one. If a student cheats, they aren't just breaking a procedural rule.
The full weight of the Triple Crown comes down.
Exactly. They are made to feel like an outlaw by the custodian, morally corrupt by the moralist, and psychologically deficient by the therapist.
Every transgression is a multiple offense against the social order. The text calls the schoolroom a magic womb where ordinary rights are completely suspended.
And the purpose of incarcerating the young in this magic womb is to condition them to accept total, unquestioned authority. It's a massive hidden curriculum that has nothing to do with reading or math.
It's a profound ritual of initiation into a submissive role.
Exactly.
Which begs the question, if you're conditioned for 15 years to accept this authority, where does it lead? What's the prize at the end of the maze?
According to the text, the ultimate finish line is the modern university.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The author's critique of the university is just scathing. He defines a graduate as someone schooled for selective service among the rich.
And he brings in staggering economic data to back that up.
The price tag of this elitism is wild. An American college graduate has consumed an education costing 5 times the median life income of half of humanity.
Just let that sink in. One American graduate costs 5 times more than half the people on Earth will earn in their entire lives.
And it's worse in Latin America. There, a university student has 350 times as much public money spent on them as a citizen of median income.
That massive financial investment puts an indelible price tag on the graduate's head. And the text argues this graduate actually sets the standard for consumption in all political systems globally.
Right. He's careful to note this isn't just an American capitalist thing. It holds true in socialist and communist countries like Russia, China, and Algeria.
Because in those systems, the academic degree is the literal key that unlocks access to state-controlled luxury. It procures the car, the airplane trips, the advanced technology.
The graduate dictates the consumer goals for everyone else. Everyone aspires to that lifestyle.
And to show how radical a shift this is, he contrasts it with the origins of the university in the Middle Ages.
Medieval scholars were basically poor beggars, right?
Yeah, they were outsiders viewed with scorn by some and deep esteem by others. They gathered in what the author calls a liberated zone to read dead masters and find critical perspectives on their present day.
It was a space of genuine academic quest and unrest. But today...
Today, everything shifted after Gutenberg and the printing press. Once knowledge moved to mass-produced print, the physical university lost its function as the sole repository of knowledge.
So it came what he calls the multiversity.
Yes. It forfeited that autonomous intellectual encounter and pivoted to managing research to produce marketable commodities and managing instruction to produce credentialed workers.
And nations started treating these graduates like strategic commodities, especially after Sputnik.
Oh, exactly. The American university system became obsessed with an arms race of credentialing. The goal was to catch up to the body count of Soviet graduates.
It became a pure numbers game. Germany abandoned centuries-old traditions to build American-style campuses. France pushed to raise education spending to 10% of their GDP.
Graduate production became a proxy for national power.
Okay, but I have to jump in on behalf of the listener here. There's a glaring contradiction. Universities are historically famous for protests and radical thought.
True.
The text was written during massive campus upheaval. He mentions groups like the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars, NACLA, and Marxist communes. If it's just a factory for compliant consumers, why does it produce people trying to burn the system down? Doesn't that prove universities foster free thinking?
That is the exact tension he addresses, and his counter-analysis is brilliant. He calls it a nuanced trap.
A trap.
Yeah. He concedes that the university provides resources, time, mobility, impunity for dissent. But he argues it only grants this freedom to those who have already been deeply initiated into the consumer society.
It's like protesting a casino, but you're only allowed to do it from inside the VIP lounge using the casino's own chips.
Perfect analogy. You have to buy into the game to get the privilege of critiquing it. The university effectively co-opts the dissenter. It gives them a safe playground, but the underlying structure of obligatory schooling goes unchallenged.
The radicals might protest the war, but they still demand their degrees.
Exactly. He says trying to reform the university without dismantling the school system beneath it is like doing urban renewal in New York City from the 12th story up.
That image is incredible. Pouring money into remodeling the penthouse while ignoring that the foundation is made of the material you're fighting against.
Precisely. So the university is the capstone of a whole belief system.
And this belief system is maintained by programming specific ideologies into students' minds, from kindergarten up to that penthouse. The text categorizes these as the 4 myths of institutional values.
Yes, let's dig into these. Myth number 1 is the myth of unending consumption.
Based on the belief that process produces value.
Right. School teaches us that the formal process of instruction mechanically produces the value of learning. The process is the product.
And once we internalize that we need an institution to learn, we become vulnerable to every other institution. We trade our innate human hope for institutional expectations.
The text says instruction smothers the horizon of our imaginations. We lose the ability to solve problems ourselves and expect everything to be prepackaged by an accredited professional.
He warns about Oedipus the teacher, too.
Yes, a fascinating concept. It's a person so addicted to being taught, so reliant on the institution for their value, that they compulsively try to teach others in the exact same institutional way.
They reproduce their own conditioned knowledge. It's a psychological contagion. Which brings us to myth number 2, the myth of measurement of values.
Where school quantifies things that are fundamentally immeasurable.
Like personal growth and imagination.
Exactly. School tells us these can be measured against a standardized rod and graded. But the author insists true growth is disciplined dissidence. It's unpredictable.
But because we're trained to believe value must be measured, we squeeze ourselves into assigned niches. We trim off the edges of our personalities to fit the metric.
And the macro consequence is terrifying. A schooled world measures societal happiness by consumer indexes. How many refrigerators we bought.
And it measures progress toward peace by body counts. If it's not on a spreadsheet, it's irrelevant.
Which flows seamlessly into myth number 3, the myth of packaging values.
Where the curriculum itself is treated as a manufactured commodity. The educator is just a distributor, and the pupil is a consumer.
Educational engineers try to predict societal demand, and the author brings in Parkinson's law here.
The rule that work expands to fill the time or resources available for its completion.
Yes. He applies it to educational bureaucracies. Administrators justify expensive new curricula by observing that learning difficulties mysteriously rise proportionately with the cost of the curriculum.
The institution creates a crisis only its new product can solve, like the example with French schools.
Right. Reading difficulties only became a heavily funded national issue in France when their per capita spending reached U.S. levels from 1950.
Which is exactly when it became an issue in the U.S.
Right.
They package a problem to sell the solution.
It's a massive self-feeding loop. Bigger budget, more complex curriculum, more students fail, more remedial programs needed.
Which leads to the 4th myth, probably the most intense analogy in the text, the myth of self-perpetuating progress.
Where he compares the logic of unending schooling directly to the logic of the Vietnam War.
And again, as the neutral host, I'm reminding everyone we're just looking at the mechanics of his argument here.
Right. He argues that just as the military measured success by an irreversible accumulation of dead bodies, the body count, the school system measures success by a never-ending accumulation of pupil hours.
Both are open-ended escalations with no stopping point.
Exactly. He says by death accounting standards, the nation wins the war forever. By school standards, the population becomes increasingly educated.
But you never actually achieve satisfaction because last year's knowledge is obsolete. You always need more.
And when you take these 4 myths together, consumption, measurement, packaging, and progress, they form a complete theology. He argues school is literally functioning as a modern religion.
The deep architecture of belief. This brings up Arnold Toynbee's historical theories.
Toynbee observed that dying, decadent cultures consistently spawn a new world church to offer hope while serving the administrative needs of a new ruling class.
And the author says school is our secular, scientific, death-denying world church.
And it has its own theology of the afterlife, or continuous life. He references Jessica Mitford and compares unending continuing education to purgatory.
There's a striking parallel.
In the Middle Ages, the church had a logistical problem. Demand for salvation outgrew a single lifetime, so they created purgatory. Souls could continue being purified under the Pope's control.
Which led to the highly profitable trade in indulgences.
Exactly, and modern society does the same with remedial programs and continuing education credits. You're never done being educated, just like a soul was never done being purified.
You just keep buying indulgences. I know some listeners might feel defensive right now about their expensive degree.
It's a natural reaction.
It is. But we have to look at how this religion functions for those who can't buy indulgences. The initiation is what he calls an obligatory lottery. Look at the stats he gave for Mexico at the time.
A child in the lower economic third had a 2 in 3 chance of entering 1st grade, and a 4 in 100 chance of finishing 6th grade.
4 out of 100. Catastrophic odds.
Yeah.
But because it's framed as an equal international standard, the 96 kids who drop out internalize their failure.
Yes, self-inflicted discrimination. They rationalize their poverty by accepting their rejection from scholastic grace.
The theological analogy is watertight. Children are born in original sin ignorance. They're baptized in 1st grade. But most go to Gehenna, the slum, believing it's their personal fault.
Grace is reserved for those who accumulate years in school. It echoes Max Weber's theory of Calvinists believing salvation belonged to those who accumulate wealth.
Now we believe secular salvation belongs to those who accumulate schooling. So what does this all mean for society? The author compares it to a cargo cult.
Right. In the 1940s in Melanesia, isolated islands saw Western militaries dropping manufactured goods cargo.
And when the war ended, they wanted the cargo back.
So cultists believed if they performed ritualistic mimicry like wearing a black tie or building fake runways, a divine figure would arrive on a steamer ship with modern goods for every believer.
It was a belief that performing the ritual would magically manifest wealth. And the author says the global school system is exactly this.
It's a liturgical cult. We sit at desks, pass tests, put on graduation robes, our version of the black tie.
We perform the ritual perfectly, expecting the steamer ship of economic paradise, the good job, the house to magically arrive.
But the school's promise is broadcast globally to everyone who submits, writing a check that physical reality simply cannot cash.
So if it's a compulsory religion, and the paradise is an illusion for most, how deeply alienated are we? And how could we revolt?
To show the scale of the required revolt, he points out school is the central engine of society. At the time, 62 million people were in school in the U.S. versus 80 million at work.
It's the fastest growing labor market. And he takes a swing at neo-Marxists here, right?
Yeah, they thought school was just a superstructure on top of capitalism. The author argues school is the main industry producing the psychological demands that drive the economy.
It pre-alienates youth before they even enter the workforce.
It teaches you the absolute need to be taught. You lose the incentive to grow independently because you believe everything must be pre-packaged by an institution.
And this is spreading. He predicts multinational corporations will evolve into supranationally planned service agencies.
And we'll all become lifelong employees of these systems.
We see it now. Transportation obliges you to consume cars and superhighways. Medical care obliges you to consume a specific definition of health.
So how do you revolt against a system that provides everything?
He argues a revolt against schools might actually be bloodless, since they aren't militarily organized. But if don't revolt,
the alternative is terrifying. He warns of sinister pseudo-schools and totalitarian managers using pedagogical therapists to drug pupils.
He even points to pedagogical torture in Brazil and Greece at the time, using random terror to break psychological integrity, making people plastic material for technocrats.
To avoid that dark conclusion, he makes his ultimate call to action. It's radically individualistic. You cannot be liberated by an institution.
Each individual is personally responsible for their own deschooling. You can't free yourself from consumption until you free your mind from obligatory school.
It requires a massive paradigm shift. He references Daniel Bell, who noted the disconnect between apocalyptic attitudes and technocratic decisions.
Basically, reformers hate the system, but can only imagine building new schools with different paint colors. They can't break the paradigm.
Which brings in Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions.
The Ptolemaic view of the universe. We thought the Earth was the center. It worked for a while, but eventually the observable facts just didn't fit the math anymore.
It required massive cognitive dissonance before the Newtonian paradigm was accepted. The author argues the anxiety and disengagement of youth today is that same paradigm-breaking pressure.
The facts of human learning no longer fit the rigid model of the obligatory school. The paradigm is cracking.
Absolutely.
We have covered so much ground today. To you, the listener, if your head is spinning or you feel defensive, that is incredibly valid.
It's designed to be overwhelming.
We deconstructed childhood, compared teachers to popes, and called universities consumer cults. But remember, you don't have to agree with his radical analogies to appreciate the profound questions he raises about how we learn.
The value is in forcing you to look at the invisible architecture of your own life and separating your genuine curiosity from institutional packaging.
Which brings us back to that medical x-ray. School offers the false comfort of a clean diploma, proving we are educated. But actual learning is complex, unmeasurable, and deeply personal. So I want to leave you with one final thought. Imagine if tomorrow, every credential, every diploma, and every degree you have ever earned suddenly vanished into thin air. What actual unmeasurable skills would you have left to offer the world? And who really taught them to you? Or better yet, how did you teach yourself? Keep questioning the hidden rituals in your own life. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.